Hi there. This podcast was recorded in early 2023. With the acknowledgement that our world and current events shift every day, we hope you enjoy this slice of life from our community's voices.
The human story is the search for belonging. From childhood to adulthood, in joy and in struggle, we all sit in questions of how to make sense of it all. What is our place? Why are we here? What is our story of searching? Join us in conversation with community members, each sharing some of their own story. I am Ben Spratt, and this is Belonging. So I am overjoyed today to get to be sitting with a fellow member of our Rodeph Sholom community. Jessica Politis has been a member of Congregation Rodeph Sholom since 2016, and she's married to David, who has been a member of Congregation Rodeph Sholom since 1984. Together they have two boys. Noah is in the third grade at Rodeph Sholom School, and Sammy is in the first grade at Rodeph Sholom School. Jessica started her career as a litigator, but now doesn't practice law and instead makes fine jewelry by hand. So Jessica, it is a joy to be with you and grateful that we get to have a conversation where we bring a bit of your journey forward. So I'd love to hear and have all of us get to bear witness to a bit of your own search for belonging. Tell us about it.
Thank you so much for having me, Rabbi. Yeah, when you told me the topic is belonging, you kind of have to think about what that means, because I feel like a lot of people kind of just go through it and they belong to some things, and it does take some thought to analyze the topic. So you clearly think about belonging as you named your podcast Belonging. How do you think of belonging in the community, and what's your take on it?
Great question. So I think what inspired this actually was many of the conversations over COVID, as I got to hear so many people feel like many of the threads of relationship and even places of belonging that gave them a sense of anchor were ripped away. And in that, there was such a sense of dislocation, a sense of alienation, of isolation, of loneliness. And in many ways, it pointed to maybe some of the weakness of some of the narratives, some of the stories, some of the threads that we held as to what gives us definition. And so the podcast was really an emergence out of trying to say, how do we take a world where there's so much fracture, so much division, so much loneliness, so much isolation, and how do we actually open up some new doors of belonging that can help people start to see that sometimes it's through finding a better story? And when I think about the people who inspire me in my life, it's because they shared something of themselves that made me feel like my own experience, my own feeling, my own sense was in that container. And that is really, I think, some of what I feel like I'm trying to do as a rabbi, as I'm trying to bump around as a fellow parent and human in this world. And what I'm hoping we get to do through this podcast is by opening a little window into your story, that all of a sudden we've widened the container of Rodeph Sholom. We've helped people see that their own threads might be woven into this larger tapestry.
I love that. When I thought about belonging, it definitely goes back to my parents and my grandparents. All four of my grandparents were born in Ukraine, and they lived there because of the Pale of Settlement. They couldn't live in most of the Soviet Union. They had to live in just a portion of the Western Soviet Union. After the Holocaust, my grandparents moved to the suburbs of Moscow, where my parents met. They've told me, these stories that are just unimaginable. So right when they got married, they had applied for political refugee to come to New York. And they won the lottery and they got it, and they came to America because they wanted to live in freedom from the oppression of the Soviet regime and freedom to practice Judaism. That was a big part of my childhood, hearing about where they came from, because I was just born a couple years after they arrived here. So belonging, the first thing I really think of is that my parents didn't belong in Russia, and they came here, and immediately they found belonging. The Jewish community helped get them here. They paid for their first apartments, and they wouldn't have been able to come to America and leave Russia without the help of the New York Jewish communities.
So, going back to your childhood, do you remember them telling you stories about their own past? I mean, were there particular experiences they wanted you to have in your childhood that helped raise your awareness about where they'd come from?
Yeah, there were the little stories about, the small act of anti-Semitism, but on a larger sense, my father applied, he really wanted to be a doctor. He applied to med school, I believe, 3 times, and he was rejected 3 times because Jews didn't get into med school. And then he tutored hundreds of kids to get into med school, and he became a really successful tutor. But you couldn't pursue the careers you wanted. You couldn't live the life that you wanted. You really were limited. I guess that was in the 70s in Russia. When I think about belonging, the freedoms that we have here, everyone belongs, and everyone has an opportunity to belong, and you have the freedom to do whatever you want, pursue any career you want. Rodeph Sholom has parties in the street, and nobody thinks twice about it. The fact that you could just, celebrate Purim in the street, celebrate Hanukkah in the street. New York is a really, really such a great place to live. And a lot of people say that there is anti-Semitism in New York, but when you compare it to what my parents went through, what my grandparents went through, you just count your blessings.
So well said. And sometimes it's so hard to look in the context of other eras and certainly other geographies and the kinds of limitations, restrictions on every level of life, not just religious expression, as you're talking about, but also career, also even the people you can be in relationship with and friendship with. And I'm curious for you growing up, did you feel like your family story made you different in any way?
Where I went to school in New Jersey, there weren't a lot of Russian families. My first language was Russian. So, yeah, definitely. I brought, caviar sandwiches to school, and the other kids made fun of me, and I loved it. My family's story in terms of Judaism, I mean, my parents enrolled me in a modern Orthodox school from pre-K. Well, first I went to Solomon Schechter, and then I went to Kushner, which was modern Orthodox, and then all the way through high school to Frisch. So I think that not being able to practice Judaism as children, not being able to study Torah, and not being able to learn Hebrew, I learned Hebrew in first grade, and I would come home and teach my parents the Aleph Bet and the basic. They didn't have an opportunity to learn Hebrew as kids, and I think we kind of did it as a family. And then quickly, my brother and I, we surpassed their Hebrew very, very quickly. But they try, and definitely my parents instilled in us a strong sense of Judaism because they couldn't have that.
Mm. And so with that kind of religious education growing up, how do you think that changed the arc of your own life? How do you think that your parents' decision to put you into that kind of immersive Jewish, experience evolved even the way that your story would unfold?
Well, Judaism is such a fundamental part of who I am. I think that I live Jewish values. It's just a part of me. I don't know what my story would be without it.
Beautiful. So for them growing up in an environment where they couldn't necessarily access that Jewishness, coming to America, wanting to ensure you could have some of the blessings that they themselves didn't grow up with, that kind of like power dynamic inversion is really interesting. That in many ways it was you being on the frontier of discovering and learning Judaism and figuring out how to transmit it at home. And I'm curious for you in the dynamic with your parents. So did they ask for that, or did you just naturally find yourself wanting to share with them what you were loving from school?
Yeah, that's so interesting. There was definitely a little bit more gravity to it, I think, maybe importance compared to my classmates because, a lot of their parents had grown up with this and it was kind of like in their family already, where my brother and I we came home and we taught our parents what we had learned because they didn't know it. So it was a different dynamic where we were students, but we were also teaching our parents. It felt important, and it felt like something my parents wanted to learn, and They observed the holidays, and we took equal parts, with our parents in leading the Seder. And then my parents started hosting these massive Russian Seders for 50 people each night. 50 Russian people that, immigrants that came over in 89, everyone started coming. And we would put up these long, long tables and have 100 people in our home over the 2 nights. And my brother and I would help lead. And, there's 5 of us. The little ones were little, but.
So, thinking about that experience and your parents not only opening your home to so many others, who had a similar story of what it was to come from Russia and try to find their own way and forge a new path here. As you now map forward into today and you get to see the war between Ukraine and Russia, these thread through 2 different elements of your own family story and identity. So how do you find yourself today kind of sitting in the nexus of that, especially now also as an American?
Yeah. When that war broke out, when Putin invaded Ukraine last year, I felt for the first time in my adult life such a strong emotional reaction. I felt like I had to do something. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know what to do. Nobody knew what to do. What are you supposed to do? But I felt moved to action. We mobilized immediately. When the war broke out, within a week, we were already reaching out to the Rodeph community, asking for humanitarian supplies. We were collecting medicine and tampons and so much. The community was so amazing and came out, and we were able to send over 5 tons of humanitarian aid, 10,000 pounds, that got into Ukraine and was distributed before the large NGOs were able to get in and to help. That was really incredible. And I'm so grateful that the community came out so strongly, and there were so many volunteers, and everyone just wanted to do something.
So if you can remember back to those first days, those first weeks, what was it from within yourself that propelled you into action?
I felt like those American Jews that helped bring my parents over as political refugees. I felt that I'm in a position to give, I must give. It wasn't even a choice for me. I wish I knew what to do at the time. Of course, you do your best and you figure it out, but I really felt the need to help those people.
Going back to the very beginning in Judaism, the most repeated injunction in the Hebrew Bible and the Tanakh is to remember that you were once strangers. Remember what it was to stand on the margins of society. And you look across the arc of Jewish history, and again, there's that experience of what it is to stand on the margins, only to then have another generation find more of a feeling of belonging, and only then to have, again, that pendulum swing back to the sense of marginalization. And it's so easy to come to a place of comfort, to find, in some ways, almost the curse that comes with the blessing of belonging is the feeling like that's no longer my story. And that sometimes with our belonging comes this vested interest of, well, everything here is good. I like what I've finally come to. And it's almost, how do we hold on to that narrative of remembering what it was to be on the fringes, to be the one persecuted, to be the one whose life hung in the balance, to wonder, does the world stage actually care about me? And I find that so remarkable that you're able to hold that, hold what it is to be with David growing an amazing, fantastic family here in New York, and also know that part of your identity threads, even in complicated ways, both to Russia and to Ukraine, and to feel like you need that narrative to come forward in action. So I'm curious, how did you communicate that to Noah and Sammy? As a parent, how did you convey all of these different threads of what's bringing you to action?
I think my parenting style is to tell them in a very mature, very clear, very direct way what's happening. I don't really treat them like children. When I talk to them, I like to tell them for real what's happening. So from the beginning, I explained to them what was happening, that Putin invaded Ukraine and nobody's stopping him. and we have to help. And there are people and children and families that don't have access to their albuterol inhalers. In April of last year, we were given a whole big warehouse space on 80th and Broadway, thanks to a Rodeph family that was really so nice. And I took the kids there, and they helped pack the boxes, and they sat there waiting for FedEx to come up, pick up 60 boxes at like 8 p.m. And I, for sure, from the beginning, explained to them what was happening and told them that they have to help too. They could help, so they did. And in their small way, they supported me, and they did what they could.
I think about the tool that gives them, almost the seed that you planted for them is they are invariably going to walk through their lives seeing a world that sometimes comes apart, and to see injustices and needs bloom. And in some ways, to feel like their own blessings of belonging comes with responsibility to figure out how to bestow those blessings to others. And it's an amazing response. I mean, you were talking about the helplessness many people felt after the outbreak of the war. And part of what you did with others was shape a pathway to activate people. What an amazing tool to give to the kids as they grow up, to feel like maybe in the moments when we feel most helpless is the time when we most need to activate.
Right.
Again, going back to this idea of the sometimes entwining of blessing and curse or challenge is, if we go back in prior generations, at times the transmission of Judaism felt like an obligation, when Judaism's fate felt like it hung in the balance. And one of the blessings is, as you were noting, living in an age where even if there is rising anti-Semitism, still it's relatively easy, at least in the context of New York, to live out Judaism to the point where many don't necessarily feel this obligation that has to be passed down to the next generation. It just is. It's in the air. It's in the ethos. And how then remarkable it is to then take up the challenges. So how do we make people fall in love with Judaism, to want it, which is maybe a question that prior generations never had to deal with before. And for you and David to be able to kind of look at your own Jewish backgrounds and what are the things that worked and what are the things that didn't, and how do you forge that? And so I'm curious if you got any advice for fellow parents like myself who are looking at our children, wanting to place seeds of identity, maybe Jewishness, maybe what it is to be an American, or 1,000 other forms of identity. How do you do it? How do you and David do it?
I think Rodeph does a really good job, so.
So outsourcing is the secret. Okay. No,
Yeah. David grew up in the same building we live now on the Upper West Side. And he went to Rodeph from, I believe, the 2s all the way through until 6th grade, which is as far as it went back then. He told me that he loved school and that he never wanted to miss a day of school. And I told him, I don't believe you. So it was kind of like, I want my kids to have his experience. And I wasn't sure how I would feel about the Reform Judaism. And I'm telling you honestly, I love it so much. I feel that Congregation Rodeph Sholom School, they teach Judaism with so much love. I wish I could make this up, but Sammy in 1st grade, he said that his favorite subject is Jewish studies. And that fills my heart up. I'm happy to say that Rodeph Sholom School hasn't changed in the last 30 years. And my kids never want to skip school. They love going to school. And we do Shabbat at home, and the boys do the brachot. And David's parents live in Israel now. And we have been to Israel so many times, so lucky. And every time we go, we make sure to take the boys to the kotel, to the wall, and put their wishes and just know that they belong there. And even if we don't live there, that Jerusalem is very important to us and all of Israel. And being able to go to Israel and having a Jewish homeland is so important to our family. David's family, my family, to our family, and to the kids. And having a really strong sense of love of Israel and Zionism, I think really grounds their Jewish identity too.
What an amazing answer. And I think such an amazing connection to your parents' legacy. I think about, taking some of the narrative that you've lifted about your parents finding belonging immediately once immigrating here to America, that belonging was tied to freedom for them, the ability to be the people they wanted to be, and maybe despite barriers that they encountered, to be able to feel like the freedom and flexibility afforded the chance for them to grow in ways they never could before. And then what it is for you and David to look at your own children and feel like part of belonging is being given the experiences that can connect you to something larger. And for you and David now thinking about, well, what are the opportunities we need to give to the kids? What are the ways that certain places can echo forward with a sense that you belong here? This is a part of your story. So, if you're willing, I'm going to have us also now take another thread, and we'll come back to this in a second here. So if we can, I would love to hear the story of how someone goes from being a litigator to getting into high-end jewelry, and to think about for yourself way they channel the very same elements of your psyche. But I'd love to hear some of that arc of what drew you into law, and then what took you beyond law.
Yeah, it's been about 8 years since I stopped practicing completely, and I'm so happy. I never really had my heart in it. And right before COVID, I felt that I needed a creative outlet. And I used to paint a lot and draw a lot. And actually, my in-laws in Israel gave me a necklace that was made by a brother and sister in Yaffo, in the old city. And they gave me this beautiful necklace and asked if I want to go meet the jewelers that made it. It was a brother and sister that it was their second career making this gorgeous jewelry by hand. She was in fashion and he was in industrial design. And I asked them, how did you figure out? They had a studio with so much equipment, and how did you do it? And they said, well, we just did it. And a light bulb went on that you could do it. I could do that too. So I went back to New York. I immediately enrolled in like this little studio in Midtown with a teacher, and I love it. I run there. I'm so happy to go there to the studio and to make beautiful jewelry by hand, and I can make whatever I want. I wear my wedding and engagement ring, but other than that, pretty much I just wear only things that I make, and I gift them to my family and friends, and they love it. The first ring that I made, the very first piece of jewelry that I made by hand, I made for my grandma. She's 95, and she wears it, and I love seeing it on her. It makes me really happy every time I see it. I think one day I'm going to have a line, but for now I'm just loving making it.
Almost 30 years ago, I walked into what was then a very, very tiny little jewelry shop in Jerusalem. And it was a jewelry shop called Hadaya, which now has become a very well-known international brand. But at the time, it was just this one guy, a tiny little jewelry shop. And he was known as being a person who would always tell you a story if you went in and bought a piece of jewelry. And I still wear the ring now. It's a ring that says Gam Ze Yavor, this too shall pass. And, there's a famous story about King Solomon in it. But I remember distinctly asking him how he got into being a jeweler. And one of the things that he spoke about was the way in which it anchored him not only in a sense that he could create in the world, but a way that he could help see people and connect with people. Again, thinking about the seed planting we do as parents and our children is, for Noah and Sammy to grow up, getting to see you putting real time and dedication into a passion, and that you've had to learn as an adult, new skills. I think about, how many kids grow up in homes where their parents already did the learning at a prior chapter of life, and now it's mostly a rinse and repeat, which for some people, that's what their career feels like. What is it for them to grow up seeing, maybe that's what it means to be a parent, is that we keep learning over and over again.
Right. I think definitely as a parent, as a human, you never stop learning. But it also actually taught me that the kids should do as a career whatever really brings them passion. And I know everyone's heard that a million times, but now I actually can feel that. You should really do what pulls you. I'm not going to tell them what they should be or what they should study. I really want them to find what brings them joy.
It makes me think about, legacy, and thinking about some of the story that you carry in your family, and even some of what you and David are shaping together, with your family, with Noah and Sammy. What are the things that we do with our days that last beyond us? And what are the ways where our personal spark actually feels needed and necessary in the world, And I'm curious, you clearly have been willing in your life to not just fall into that trap. You've been willing to, in a number of different fronts, be willing to step up and say, I actually have something. There's something that I can do or that I must do. I'm wondering if you have any other areas where you see that coming out in you, because not everyone does that, Jessica. Not everyone responds to a world event and says, I need to roll up my sleeves and do something about it. Not everyone feels like, there's something missing in my life. I want to go and take on a new passion and bring that forward in a way where I can create something wondrous and beautiful.
I think that I'm really lucky to be able to follow my passions. I'm super grateful every day that I don't have to be a lawyer and that I have the time and that I have the ability, if I want to, start fundraising, that I could do that and start helping people for a humanitarian crisis. I feel so lucky that I have that flexibility and ability. I mean, tomorrow I'm bringing 10 laptops to a charter school in Brooklyn that took in 120 kids from Ukraine in the last year. And it wasn't too difficult to kind of scrounge up some laptops, and these kids need them. So I feel blessed for the ability to be able to help people when I can.
So if you were going to imagine 20 years from now, Noah and Sammy sitting down and the question of where do they belong and how do they belong? If you could wave a magic wand, what would you want them to be feeling? How would you want them to experience belonging decades from now?
Or 20 years from now, how old will they be? Marriage age, right?
I mean, yeah,
30s?
probably about 30 or so.
About 30. I hope that they will be living a life that they feel happy to do whatever they're doing every day. And maybe they'll have some kids, and that they'll instill in them that kind of identity, the Jewish identity, and doing what they can to be good people, to be good, kind people.
I think the idea of how do we help our children feel proud of who they are, feel like they have the tools, the values that can guide them, especially in the moments that are most difficult. Again, I think about the story that your parents have passed down to you.
Yeah.
And the way in which that also gave you a feeling of purpose. And I'm curious, when you think about the narratives that you and David are passing on to Noah and Sammy, what do you think is some of the purpose they feel?
Yeah, this is something David and I talk about a lot. Raising kids in Manhattan, it's really hard to, keep it real. And it's something that I think parents raising kids in Manhattan have to make a concerted effort to teach their children to give back, to teach their children to help people that are less fortunate, and even just so that they know how fortunate that they are. I think that has to be a real effort on the part of the parents.
And again, I think that goes back to this idea that we're supposed to tell the story of the Exodus, over and over, that we're obligated as parents to pass this from generation to generation, this idea that the stories we choose to tell actually shape our feeling of where we belong and what it is to be a part of a sense of peoplehood or identity where ultimately our place of belonging is at the margins. It's a very odd inversion. Most of us are trying to do all we can to run away from being on the margins, run away from that feeling of being other. And yet there's something indelibly entwined with kind of the Jewish psyche from the beginning that's actually where we're supposed to belong. That in many ways, when we find that place of comfort, what do we have to do to propel ourselves to walk out, to stand with those who stand on the margins? And you and David are modeling that and imagining, what gets planted for Noah and Sammy as they're, helping to, pack up, these FedEx packages at 8 p.m. at night, and imagine what does that say to them when they see an issue in the world, rather than, oh, well, everything's good on my end, to be able to feel like that's the call to action, that's ultimately where I belong. It's remarkable. So I want to offer gratitude. It is not an easy thing to simply sit down, dive into the kinds of conversations that aren't naturally necessarily bubbling up. But I want to offer gratitude because I think in looking at how can family story, how can personal story, how can the story of our next generation rising up, how can the story of career all weave together, how can the story of New York both herald something wonderfully new and also something that feels very familiar as we go back to prior generations. I think it gives an open door for so many people as they think about how their own story matters, how others can feel needed and necessary. And I know from myself and my own search for belonging, it's often to figure out, how does my particular take on this, how does my particular refraction of these human stories actually play into something else? And I want to offer just gratitude because for me personally, I feel like you just gave me some wonderful tools for me as a parent, and to think about, what are those seeds that I'm planting, and how can I make sure that it's not just happiness, but also a feeling of purpose that I really am inspiring in.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thank you for joining us and listening to this story of belonging. Stay connected with us on Facebook and Instagram. You can find me on Twitter at Ben H. Spratt. For more information about CRS, visit us online at rodeph sholom.org.